Hey everyone, we've been taking a look at Impressionism as the first modern movement. I wanted to take a look at what happens after Impressionism and what became known as post-Impressionism, and what happened within the group as they become dissatisfied and finding that the ideas of Impressionism are somewhat limited. I like this particular view. This comes from the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, which used to be a train station, and they turned into a modern art exhibit. And so a lot of the Impressionists and post-Impressionists that we've been taking a look at will be in this museum. And at the top floor, there is a clock that you can look through, and out on the far distant hill, you can see the Sacré-Cœur, which is a church building on top of a hill. And that hill that you see is where many of the artists used to live in the 19th century. And so kind of an interesting juxtaposition of where they used to live and where their works currently reside. It was a kind of not a far journey in distance, but it was a long journey in terms of artistic importance and relevance, where they were seen as hacks or charlatans, or they were seen as, inferior artists, and their art was scorned to a point where now it's praised and put within one of the best museums in the world. Let's take a look at what happened with the end of Impressionism. Mainly, Impressionism ends in a large part because it's a victim of its own success, as many things tend to be. As the movement starts to gain international fame, artists start becoming a little bit more biting and contentious, and there's a lot more jealousy and disagreements that start to emerge, which tends to happen often with success. It tends to be people's undoing. Similar things happen with Impressionism, right? It starts with this underground movement that is largely mocked in the art world, to becoming widely popular, and everyone wants a Monet, or everyone wants a Degas, and so it becomes extremely popular. But people such as Cézanne, who originally had roots in Impressionism, begins to lose faith in the group and wants to find new directions to paint, rather than just focusing on ocular representations and how the light and shading influence the work. He wants to go in new directions, and we see similar ideas with Renoir. He wants to focus on nudes, and he felt that the Impressionism has come to its end, right? That's kind of a quote that he writes, that there's the end of Impressionism, that it just kind of has a natural end in his mind, right? Everything has a beginning and end. He says, I kind of reached the end of this, so let's move on, right? And so he meets Georges Seurat in 1885 and starts a new movement that they call Divisionism, and it's later going to be called Pointillism. And so he just kind of finds his own limitations, and even Monet, who is kind of the main leader of Impressionism, at least stylistically the leader, the one that most people are familiar with. He becomes dissatisfied with the group and kind of distances himself from them. However, his art style remains true to the principles of Impressionism throughout his life. And so where Renoir and Cézanne start to do other things, and even Van Gogh has some roots in Impressionism, they start to go on and do different things stylistically. Monet really stays true to Impressionist principles throughout his life. And mainly, I don't know, my thought on that is it's probably because he was so successful as an artist. Why kill the golden goose and do something new that your audience that you have developed is going to be gonna not like, right? But there's this kind of infighting that starts to happen with these disagreements about what Impressionism is, what it should be, how it should evolve, and eventually a lot of them just go their separate ways. But what's important about Impressionism, in addition to all of the art that we have, that is wonderful and great and beautiful, but it's really the legacy of what Impressionism starts, right? It influences either directly or indirectly most of the movements that come after it. And so of the art movements that come after it have to go through Impressionism in some way. They have to reconcile it, right? Because it becomes such a large part of the art discussion and so widely popular that artists are either going to react against it or are going to have to embrace some principles of it and then move on and find their own style. And so either directly or indirectly, it's going to influence the art movements that come after it. But one of the major influences is that begins this movement away from tradition, right? And it's not that art hasn't moved away from tradition. Clearly, the Baroque era starts moving away from Mannerism or late Renaissance, and the early Renaissance is moving away from the Middle Ages, and so that's a trend in art to do something new and different and innovative. So that's not necessarily extremely new, but the way in which they did it was the idea of this avant-garde. We're taking the reins of society. We're suggesting that art can lead and direct society to a new ideal. That is relatively new. Their radicalism within their art. And I know that if you take a look at Mary Cassatt or Renoir, they don't look radical. But in terms of their art style of their day, they are very radical in terms of what art is doing and how they're pushing the boundaries of stylistically of art. And so the idea that art should be this avant-garde, this new, this kind of radical ambition to do something that hasn't been done before, that becomes extremely influential for the art that comes after it. The other major influence, which is extremely important, is they destroyed the stranglehold of the salons, right? The idea that anyone can start their own art movement, or a group of people can start their own art movement, is going to be largely influential for everything that comes after it. You're just going to have artists saying, we're going to band together, we're going to start our own art movement, and we don't need these salons, we don't need museums, we don't need curators. We're just going to do something that we're passionate about and let the audience eventually catch up and follow, right? So that's another major event that Impressionism really begins, right? They also loosen up the brushstroke, making the brushstroke more about celebrating the hand of the artist rather than disguising the hand of the artist. We see it at the forefront. So there's this kind of this tension between whether something is a sketch or a finished work, where in the earlier works of art, their art would have been considered, well, that's a nice sketch, but let's see what the finished work looks like when you try to disguise your hand. And Impressionists say, no, that is my finished work. My finished work is the sketch, right? This is the process of seeing. It's the process of how an artist can interact with the world, sees the world, and can express this in a certain way that the viewer can then feel and understand the process of art, right? So art as a process is an important part of the Impressionist legacy. Let's take a look at Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism is just a kind of a generic label for a group of artists that come after Impressionism. And what you're going to see is there's going to be a group of artists that used to be Impressionists or tied to it in some way, starting with the style maybe. Some of them were formerly members. Some of them were just kind of influenced by it. But they have some type of start in Impressionism or Impressionist style, and then they just do something else. And because they're all unique in their style, there's no real style that merges them together, like Impressionism, where they're all kind of coming together, banding together, doing one thing, or Realism, they're all coming together, having a social commentary within their message. They're just doing something different. And so what happens is art historians take a look at what's going on in the 1880s, 1890s, and they say, well, there's a group of artists that's doing something very different from Impressionism. What do we call them? And they just give them the label Post-Impressionism, what comes after Impressionism. But it's not to say that they were really working together as in the same way that that Impressionists were working together. So it's a term coined by art critic Roger Fry in 1910. So again, it's coming after Post-Impressionism, and that's a lot of what happens in art history, is that critics come by later and they say, okay, how can we group these things together? And sometimes it's more generic and forced than others, but it's just a way of thinking about it or commenting on it. It's a language that we develop. So when we say Post-Impressionism, we know who we're talking about. We know and roughly what we're dealing with, right? And it's really it's a rebellion in some ways against the Impressionist movement during the 1880s and 1890s. It's just suggesting that Impressionism has come to an end and moving beyond it. The term focuses on the works of Seurat, Cézanne, Van Gogh, and Gauguin. So those are the major artists of Post-Impressionists. Each artist has roots in Impressionism, but later expanded beyond its artistic principles, and each felt that limited to Impressionism adherence to visual reality and sought new methods of artistic expression. And so we're moving away from their visual reality towards more abstraction. So what we're going to see in this class is a movement from representational art to abstract art. So a lot of people wonder why modern art looks the way it does. Why is it so abstract? When it's so much easier to tell whether something is valuable by it being closer to representational reality. And what artists are doing is they're responding to their world, that there's this natural tendency to move towards abstraction. One of the major reasons for this is the development of photography in the 19th century, right? Photography comes around in 1820s, becomes a little bit more popular, 1840s, 1850s, and by the end of the century, photography was fairly common. And so photography is a way of capturing the visual world, which was the kind of mainstay of artists, right? That's what artists are dealing with, was visual reality. And so rather than competing with photography, artists say, well, we're going to do something different and we're going to look at reality differently. And so they move towards abstraction, partly because of photography, not solely because of photography, but partly as a response to that, right? So we've taken a look at realism, which is closer to representational art, looks realistic. Then we move away from that a little bit with Impressionism. With Impression Sunrise, we see kind of just the globs of paint, but together they create this ocular reality within the mind of the viewer. The Post-Impressionism moves further away from that, focusing on trying to get away from visual reality and more about imagination and the insights and of the artist. And so moving away from that, symbolism focuses more on the inner psyche, the inner mind, imagination of the artist. And then expressionism focuses more on this idea of just expressing the ideas of the artist. And then we're going to even move further to the 20th century with works like Jackson Pollock, Willem de Kooning, and Mark Rothko, with complete abstraction, right? Abstract expressionism in the 1940s, 50s, and somewhat in the early 60s. And so there's this movement away from representational art. Now what we have today, though, is we've gone so far with abstraction, there's nothing left to do if you're going to push against the prevailing masters of the day than to go a little bit back towards representational art. And so the pendulum has swung back towards moving towards representational art in some way. But this is just the trend, and giving you a kind of a brief overview of why art is moving towards abstraction, focusing more on the insights and the emotions of the artist rather than the visual world, which is what is the legacy of the Renaissance. How do we capture the visual world as clearly as we can? Let's take a look at a few artists of Post-Impressionism and how their art is different and distinct, what it's doing in terms of its response to Impressionism, and how it's different from other artists of Post-Impressionism. And what I've given you is a brief definition or bio of each artist. As we get towards the modern world, as we come towards the 20th century, we're going to be studying a lot more artists. And so we're going to go through this a lot quicker. So the pace of the artists and their works are going to become a lot quicker. So I'm giving you kind of a brief overview of each artist to let you know just briefly what to think about as you encounter their works in this class or beyond this class and other classes or in art museums, just a way to contextualize them. Now, this is my summary. These are my summaries of these artists. They can be limited. This is just my interactions with them over the last 20 years and my understanding of what they're trying to do. But again, new art research might come out that suggests new insights, new journals, new works of art are being discovered all the time, often in someone's backyard or barn, and I never know why that's not in my backyard, but new works are being discovered, interestingly, all the time, and so new insights come about, and so these ideas can somewhat change, but there's kind of where we're understanding these artists today, right? Seurat was influenced by Impressionism. In April 1879, he visited the fourth Impressionist exhibition, where the paintings of Monet and Pissarro in particular caused in him an unexpected and profound shock, which that's kind of what Impressionism was, right? That's one of the legacies of Impressionism, is this shock, right? Doing something so radically different in terms of art that it creates this shock, right? He also was interested in the optics of color and the scientific study of color formulated by Michel Eugene Chevril, the law of simultaneous contrast of colors, which we'll take a look at. So he's interested in the idea of how colors influence one another. This rule states that two different colors put side by side will reflect each other. Example, blue and yellow will form purple in the eye. Don't ask me scientifically about why that is. It seems like it would reflect green. I'm not exactly sure about the science behind it. I'm just trusting the research of others. He was interested in how shades under the surface and the quality of light influence what we see. And so an example of this would be this dress, which hit the internet, I don't know, about 6, 7, 8 years ago, something like that. Where there was a great debate whether this was a purple and blue dress or a white and gold dress. But the idea for this is not to get into that kind of endless debate. It's just to show you that colors reflect one another. And in that interaction, that exchange between colors, they form different colors in the eyes of the viewer. And so in a similar way that we see with Impressionism, suggesting that certain colors or blobs of paint influence the eye so that we see a boat on a river or a lake in France, and there's a sunrise that's happening, right? So these colors are coming together, creating this kind of optical illusion in our minds that we then say boat and water. A similar idea we're seeing here, but it's more focused on colors and how colors, rather than shading, how colors influence one another and interact with one another, right? So that's really what he's focusing on. This one's kind of more of an earlier work, but this is The Fissures on the River Seine, which is a river that runs through Paris. What we see here is the broader brushstrokes that capture vague outlines of the fishermen, the boat, the water, and then the kind of the shore that the two fishermen closest to us are sitting on. The thick paint is used to see the motion of the brushstroke, right? So capturing this as quickly as we can. So we see that there is some overlap between what he's doing and Impressionism, right? So we can see the roots that are firmly planted here, right? But this is, again, the emphasis on the hand of the artist. This is no longer about the Baroque art that's trying to disguise the hand of the artist to make it look so real that a bird would land in the window or, on the painting because they think it's a window. The idea here is to demonstrate that this is a work of art, to celebrate the hand of the artist, which is in some ways a response to photography, right? What's one thing that artists have that photography doesn't? Brushstrokes, right? The insights of the artist, right? So to kind of putting those on the forefront, celebrating them, and demonstrating also the idea of how these colors interact with one another. And we see this green, and then we see this kind of orangish brown, and we suggest, oh, this must be some grass, and this must be some sand. This over here with the white and the kind of lavender color, and then the blue, this must be water, right? And so again, this kind of exchange, which is giving us information on what is being represented. And we say, oh, fishermen on the Seine. Or this one, the laborers. And this one, again, demonstrating the ideas of this thick application of paint. We can see here that this is so thick that it actually has this shadow, right? This brushstroke has a shadow underneath it, which gives it this kind of thicker kind of celebration of the hand of the artist. And we're going to see Van Gogh is going to elaborate on that even further. But it's similar themes to Impressionism, right? The idea of laborers. This looks kind of like a Pissarro painting, which Pissarro paints a lot of people that are off in this agrarian setting and they're working. Similar to the themes of realism. Realism focuses on the working class, and a lot of their works of art focus on the agrarian working class and how hard that is. And think about Millet's The Sower. But this is different from Impressionism in that the lighting is much less of the focus than it is about the colors. I mean, we do see the sun coming up over this wagon here and over the haystack over here. We see this kind of lighter colors of the yellow, the tans. They give this impression of the sunrise. But it's not necessarily about the shading as much as it is about just the exchange of putting paint on a canvas. And in some ways, it's not really about the workers per se as much as it would be in Impressionism or Realism, where you're focusing on people, focusing on the modern industrial world and how people are responding to that. This is more just about representing life and the colors, and that's it. And so in some ways, the people, maybe this sounds a little bit weird, but the people kind of take a back seat, and it's more about just the representation of how an artist is capturing these elements. And it's not to say that the people aren't important or aren't significant in Seurat's work. It's just that he's really interested in this idea of science and study. And this is what he says. Some say they see poetry in my paintings. I see only science. And so that kind of reiterates that point of what he's trying to do is he's trying to understand how colors impact one another and reflect one another to give us the impression of scientifically how we see. At the Bathers at Anya gives us a similar idea. This one's a little bit more clear in terms of the brushstroke. Here he's thinking more about dots rather than these loose, broad brushstrokes that we see here. His brushstrokes are becoming much more precise, and he's going to become more closer into that idea of pointillism, where we just see these people that are on the beach just kind of swimming at leisure, right? So very similar to what we see with the ideas of Renoir, or mainly Renoir, where we just see a lot of the upper middle class at leisure. We see similar ideas here. People at leisure, people on a boat. We have a sailboat over here, just kind of enjoying life. And then off in the distance, we see the industry, the factory, the proletariat, the lower class that's working. And these individuals get to enjoy time off. They don't have to work the 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. They get some time off to be able to enjoy the leisure. And so in some ways, a lot of people connect Seurat to some type of radical socialism, and this idea that there's this undercurrent of this tension between the background of the industry versus the rising bourgeoisies who get to have this leisure. And so that kind of complexity within his work. And it's there. I definitely think that there can be an argument made for that. It's not necessarily what I want to emphasize this semester, but there's definitely some arguments that can be made for some kind of ideas of seeing the tensions of this rising capitalist industrial world, and that's below the surface of his works. But mainly what we're seeing here, what I want to focus on, is just how the brushstroke is becoming tighter, and he's more focusing on how colors reflect a work rather than shading, right? It's not as much about shading. This one is his major piece. This is one that you guys are all familiar with, I'm sure. The Sunday Afternoon, the Island of Le Grand Jatte. Similar ideas that we see with the Bathers at Enya, where we see the people that get to have this leisure are the people that are the rising kind of bourgeoisies that are able to take a Sunday afternoon and go in their very fancy clothes and sailboats and enjoy leisure, right? Which again, that leads the tendency to think about the undercurrents of who's not represented, and that's not really the bourgeois, the proletariat that gets to enjoy this. It's going to be the upper middle class. And so we do see that there is some of that tension within his work, but again, I want to focus more on how his brushstroke is becoming smaller and smaller to a point where it's just dots on a canvas. And I think the close-up of the monkey in the foreground, right? Just a close-up of this little guy here gives us a clear indication of what he's doing with pointillism, right? Just putting millions of dots on a canvas, and then these dots reflect one another to a point that it gives us the impression of a brown monkey, right? But if you look closer, there's all sorts of colors. There's pinks, there's purples, there's blues, there's greens all throughout. And the idea here is he's thinking about how colors reflect one another, right? So you can't just throw a monkey out into the ground. I guess you wouldn't throw a monkey, but if you put a monkey on the ground, he's going to also reflect the greens of the grass around him. They're going to reflect the sun, right? So it's going to have all these colors, this rich tapestry of colors that's going to create this overall image that we see. So again, trying to get as close to reality as we can. Similar to what we see with representational art, but not representational art in terms of not disguising the brushstroke right directly, right? It kind of seems disguised when you kind of take a step back and you're standing back from it. It kind of looks like, oh yeah, you don't really see the brushstroke as vividly. But as you look closer and closer, you start to see, the brushstroke is not being disguised. He's trying to celebrate the brushstroke, right? Similar idea. So aesthetically, there's some similarities between this and Renoir in terms of representing the new money. but very different for Impressionism, because number one, Impressionism was about trying to capture the elements quickly, right? Capture your subjects quickly before the lighting changes. But this is going to take a lot of time to be able to put all these dots on the canvas, right? So yes, it's different from Impressionism in the fact that it's just going to take a lot more time. The other thing that's interesting about this in terms of Impressionism is not really about the lighting, right? If you take a look at the shadows don't match up, right? It's taken at different times of the day. And if you take a look at the sailboats, right, this one, the wind is coming from this direction from the right to the left. This one, it looks like the wind is coming from the left to the right. And so even the wind doesn't match up. And for Seurat, he's not suggesting that it has to be as accurate to reality as Impressionism. Impressionism focuses on what do we see, trying to record what we see before it changes. He's suggesting that it doesn't have to be about that. It's just representing the world around us, representing how the eye sees and how the eye pieces together the information, and then we can see it and then understand it and say, oh, this is a bunch of people at an island, of a very posh island on a Sunday afternoon, right? And then when you start to know art history, you get to understand a lot more about the parodies that come about, how people subtly echo these ideas, and it gives us a greater context because we're entering into the larger cultural discussion. But again, similar to the ideas that we see with Renoir, this is just me standing next to it to give you the sense of the size of this particular work. It's pretty large. This one is at the Art Institute in Chicago. This is another one that he does. We see similar ideas with this, where he's using pointillism in order to convey the image of the Eiffel Tower, which becomes the symbol of this modern world. At the time, it was the largest human-made structure in the world at 917 feet, something like that. But it becomes a symbol of this modern industrial world, and he's representing that symbol, but he's doing so differently in terms of Impressionism, not necessarily focusing on lighting, but just focusing on how colors will interact with one another and find new meaning, new ideas. And for him, it wasn't about mixing colors together; it's about leaving the purity of the colors as they were and letting the eyes piece together information. Let's take a look at Paul Cézanne. He's mainly going to be the artist of the 19th century that influences artists of the early 20th century the most, right? So his works of art are going to become legendary, particularly to Picasso, who says at the very bottom, Cézanne is the father of us all, right? Kind of the father of modern art because of what he does. I want to take a look at what he does that's so different, right? But he suffers from anxiety. He's temperamental. He's shy. He's prone to bouts of depression. He could be volatile, expressing anger, especially if someone criticized or expressed their opinions about his work. He was very, very protective of his art. So he came off often as kind of abrasive, but he started to soften later in life. But he seemed to have difficulties coping with the everyday realities of this changing world around him. And some of his art is going to reflect that, reflect this constant anxiety and tension of an ever-changing world, as he suggests that life is fearful. Living in a urbanizing world of industrialism and whatnot, he starts to become, it's a very tense time, very similar to what we see kind of today, we're kind of struggling with a lot of upheaval, social, political upheaval that's happening. It seems like truth is ambiguous, so it seems like we're living in unsteady times. His father was a banker and wanted Cézanne to follow in his footsteps. That's going to be a common theme that we're going to see with artists of the modern world, is that their families are going to come from money, and they're going to want their children to become bankers or lawyers, and they're going to become dissatisfied with that and become artists, right? In 1861, Cézanne abandoned his law studies and studied with realist painters like Millet and Manet. His early works focused on romantic themes of violence and drama, but were constantly rejected by the salons, and this is kind of enter Impressionism, right? He's kind of part of that disgruntlement towards the salons. He then became influenced by Pissarro, who is kind of the father or the voice of Impressionism and moved to the Impressionist movement, depicting everyday objects and adopted a more broken brushstroke and lighter color palette. And so we're going to see him transition beyond Impressionism and focus more on different ideas, different themes. He participated in the first and the third Impressionist exhibitions, and so he was an Impressionist. He did have those roots, but then he says, I want to do something different, right? He rarely dated his works, which makes it extremely difficult for art historians to say precisely when works of art were created and try to create a timeline. But nevertheless, his works, we kind of can sense about when they were roughly, just in terms of his artistic evolution. But it does make it challenging to put a specific date on his particular work. But in this class, I don't really ask you dates of works anyway, so it's fine for our purposes. His techniques, though, he focused on this idea of impasto, which we've seen a little bit with Seurat in his early works, where this thick application of paint. That's what impasto is, a thick application of paint to a point where it has this texture of its own, this kind of three-dimensional quality of the paint itself. He likes to focus on nature rather than people or industrial scenes. He likes to get away from the industrial world and focuses on the natural world. What we're going to see is he's going to focus on simplicity, simple shapes, and simple colors. And I think this is his response, perhaps, this is my interpretation, his response to the chaos and anxiety of an ever-changing world, right? He wants to kind of break everything down to its basics. So you're going to see basic shapes, triangles, squares, right? Spheres, cylinders within his works. And that's pretty much it, right? Very simple shapes, very simple colors, a very simple color palette. You just see 4 or 5 colors represented rather than Monet that gives us a wider palette. There's going to be a sense of timelessness within his works, which is very different from Impressionism, which gives you immediacy, capturing it now, right? That Cezanne wants to focus more on these eternal qualities rather than the temporariness of the modern world. So this is his reaction to a changing world of anxiety. He says, let's focus on things that are continuous, right? So we're going to see that within his works. And then there's the main thing that's going to influence the artists that come after him, which is why Picasso says he's the father of us all, is this questioning of linear depth. There's going to be a flatness to his work. And so, again, as artists are moving towards abstraction, this is going to be a key feature because since 1420, with Brunelleschi's linear perspective, it's been focusing on depth within the work, and he's starting to flatten it and change that, right? We see a little bit of that happening with Japonisme and Impressionism. He's going to take it to the next step, and artists after him, such as Picasso, are going to really run with that with Cubism. And so he has this wide influence of artists that come after him. This is kind of interesting. So he was familiar with Monet, ran in the same circles with Monet, but this is what he says about his art. Monet is nothing but an eye, yet what an eye. And I don't think that there's a better backhanded compliment than that. Monet is nothing but an eye, yet what an eye. And I think, yes, in some ways that's true. Monet had an impressive eye. In fact, if I was to be in charge of my own home decoration, which I'm not, my wife is, so I don't really get a say, but if I was to choose a color palette, I would go to a Monet painting because he focuses on the colors that go so well together, right? So he has this impressive eye of bringing colors together to give this kind of emotion, this sense of whatever season it is. But the idea that he suggests that Monet is nothing but an eye suggests that there's no meaning, there's no deeper significance to his works, that it's just there to be seen, and it's not really having any type of depth or commentary to it. And in some ways that might be true. I think Monet would respond to, that's kind of the point, though. I'm trying to get away from romanticism. I'm trying to get away from realism, which has these larger social commentaries. I just want to represent this natural change, this world around us, this ever-changing world, modern world, as accurately as I can. And so I think Monet would say, yeah, I don't see that as a problem. Cezanne sees it as a problem and sees it as a limitation, and so he starts moving beyond it, right? He's also influenced by the past. I think he has some interesting insights into the past. He says the Louvre, which is one of the major museums in the world centered in Paris, is the book in which we learn to read. We must not, however, be satisfied with retaining the beautiful formulas of our illustrious predecessors, right? So we need to learn the masters. but we can't stay there and only do what they're doing, right? So again, we tend to, in our world today, tend to say Renaissance is kind of the pinnacle, and every work of art that comes after it we judge by Michelangelo or Leonardo or Raphael, and we say, how well do they measure up against these masters, right? And so a lot of people take a look at modern art and say, well, they don't measure up, right? Picasso's, three eyes on one side of the face or whatever doesn't quite measure up to the masters, therefore it's not as good. And he suggests that, art needs to be radical, it needs to be evolving, it needs to change as society changes. And so we can't just stay with the Renaissance and their legacy. Let us go forth to study beautiful nature. Let us try to free our minds from them. Let us strive to express ourselves according to our personal temperaments. Time and reflection, moreover, modify little by little our vision and at last comprehension. And so the idea that he wants to study nature and he wants to be freed from visual reality to be able to do something different from it, right? So again, trying to remove the shackles of representational art, to move closer towards that line of abstraction. And the idea of expressing himself. Artists need to be able to be free to express themselves, and rather than just being like a camera and just taking a painting of the world around, right? As you would take a photograph. This is one of his major works. This is Mount Saint Victoire, which is seen here. So this is what he's representing. And he comes back to this throughout his life. But again, he's not representing Paris. He's not representing the modern world. He's trying to escape from that. And that idea of escapism is also going to be largely influential as artists are seeing the rise in alcoholism, the rise in prostitution, the rise in crime, and the urban world. As the urban world starts to change and grow, they start to say, maybe we need to escape from that and get back to our natural elements. And so that's going to be a key to a lot of other artists, particularly today. We'll be taking a look at Gauguin. But this is what he says: nature is always the same, but as the aspect which appears to us, nothing lasts. Our art must give to it the frisson of its duration, with the elements and semblance of all these changes. And so in some ways, nature is constantly changing in terms of the season, but in some ways, this mountain is going to be there, our generation, the next generation, several generations beyond, unless I guess it's excavated for natural resources, but it's mainly going to be there. The elements aren't really going to change this. Nature is not really going to change this all that much over generations, right? It's going to take millennia to be able to change. So he suggests there is that continuity which he's seeking within his particular art. Let's take a look at the analysis of this and how it corresponds to Cézanne's works and his vision. Number one, we see a very simple color palette, right? We see the blues in the sky. We see the grays and the tans of the mountain. We see the yellows and the light and dark greens of the tree. And that's pretty much it. And he reflects all of those within, whatever shapes he's creating, right? And then we see, simple shapes. This is just a long rectangle. This is kind of like a cylinder shape for a tree, right? Tree branch is kind of rectangle, kind of a cylinder. And then we see here is just kind of this triangle, pyramid shape. Very simple, basic shapes. Triangle, and then we have a rectangle, and it's just very, very simple shapes, right, within his work of art. So again, he's not necessarily about trying to add complexity, he's about trying to add simplicity, right? So one thing that this does, right, the simplicity of it captures this eternal quality, right? This idea that it's going to last forever. He's not about representing, the morning. He's not about representing the setting sun. He's about representing things that are going to last forever, right? The idea of the tree here is not really going to change all that much. The mountain isn't going to change all that much. And so rather than capturing the immediacy of this industrial world that we see with Impressionism, he's not really about that. Another thing to think about in terms of Cézanne is how he flattens the canvas and gives us different perspectives. We don't see necessarily different perspectives within this particular work, but we do see a flatness, right? As you take a look, the colors of the mountain are reflected in the tree trunk, right? And the colors of the branches, right? The leaves or pine needles, not really sure, are reflected in the trees and the village below, right? And what that does is it makes the foreground and the background appear to come together as if they overlap. And so it gives it that sense of flatness. We don't know how far away the mountain is. It could be, 100 miles. It could be 5 miles. We don't really know. And his idea for this is, let's change the way that art is being represented, right? So it's not about trying to capture the immediacy of the world around us. It's about trying to do something quite different. This one, I will argue, is one of the most radical works of art of the 19th century. And I know you take a look at this and you think, it's just a basket of apples with what appears to be, these are breadsticks, but appears to be Twinkies that are off in the right-hand side. So it doesn't really look all that radical, but it is, right? Let's take a look at how it's radical. What he does here is, rather than pointing from one perspective that Brunelleschi develops, that every artist after him focuses on, which means that the artist is standing in one place, painting directly as he or she sees, and all lines converge at the central axis, right? Cezanne says, well, theoretically, what if we were to implement two perspectives? How would that look? How would we do that? And so here we have two perspectives that are coming together, right? So if you follow the back of the line of the table, what happens to it, right? It drops way down here, right? And so it's given us a different perspective. And as we take a look at the apples look as though we're looking directly at them at eye level. But if we look at the breadsticks, it seems as though we're looking slightly up at them, right? And he disguises this subtly, right? He disguises it with the wine bottle here, and with the cloth here, and then with the kind of the table, or the apples just kind of strewn out. But he disguises that perspective, so it looks kind of normal when we take a look at it, but closer investigation shows that he's actually, he paints one side of it, and then he drops the canvas and paints the second side of it to give us two perspectives. And notice the blocks, right? The blocks that are holding up the table, right? There's two blocks over here. There's only one block over here that gives us that different perspective. So similar to what we see with Caravaggio, right? Just representing, this idea. I mean, Caravaggio is about representing the temporariness of the fruit to give us this memento mori, this reminder that we're going to die. He takes that same theme of a basket of apples, but he changes it, right? He changes it to add that perspective. And thinking about this in terms of how Caravaggio is representing this, in terms of shading, he doesn't really use traditional shading here. He just uses color blocks, right? And again, there's a very simple use of palettes. We have the greens and the yellows. We have the oranges and the reds. We have the yellows and the tans, and that's pretty much it within this particular work. This is me standing next to it. One of my son's favorite works. This one's also at the Art Institute in Chicago. But in connection with Monet, right? Thinking about how Monet is doing this in terms of early Impressionism versus what Cezanne's doing in post-Impressionism, we see the clear difference, right? What we see with Monet is he's capturing about the lighting and how the lighting influences the flowers on the left side and how it's shaded on the right side. And we see the lighting as it influences the grapes and it shines off the apples. We don't see that with, my mouse is going rogue. We don't see that with Cezanne's Still Life in a Basket of Apples, right? We don't necessarily see. We really don't know where the lighting is coming from. It seems like it's coming from the back of the left shoulder of the artist, kind of shining down. We see it kind of reflected here, but that's the only indication that we have of any type of lighting. This one is another radical one. This one is really odd if you take a look at it. This one, if you take a look at Still Life of a Basket of Apples, you just think, okay, it looks normal. This one doesn't look normal. It doesn't look right, and for a number of reasons, right? Still Life with a plaster Cupid. And what's interesting about this one is he gives us these multiple perspectives as though he, as the artist, is surveying his own studio. This is how an artist would survey the studio. Not necessarily focusing on any one object, but just seeing things as though you're scanning the area and objects are there. They just exist in your mind and in your impressions. And so you just kind of see and experience them, right? So as we take a look at the Cupid, right? The Cupid looks like it's kind of on the table, right? And the table's we're kind of up from above. But then as you take a look at the studio going backwards, it has this sharp angle. So either this studio was was built on a massive angle, or he's giving us multiple perspectives, right? As we take a look at the apple, right? The apple here is the same size as the apples down here, which in terms of perspective would be wrong, right? So either these are very tiny apples and this one's a normal size, or this one is about the size of a basketball. And so again, he's giving us this sense of, I mean, as an artist, you're looking around the room, you're not necessarily thinking about the exact size, the scientific study of how things fit together. You're just giving a quick impression as you survey the room around. So different from Seurat, who is focusing on the idea of scientific study and how we see things, right? But it's kind of ironic that and we see similar ideas with the onions, right? The onions are different sizes, which gives us this kind of, it's getting us away from visual reality, right? But it's interesting that he puts in this plaster Cupid, which gives us this sense of tradition. What the Renaissance was focusing on is Greco-Roman art and architecture, right? So he gives us this sense of tradition, but then he places it within the context of very radical ideas of putting multiple perspectives and placing things that don't really match up in terms of size together. That he's suggesting that, yes, the ancients are important, but yet we need to move beyond them and think about maybe we just don't paint exactly what scientifically we see. We paint how we feel, how we experience life, right? And that leads us to the next artist that I want to take a look at with Monet, right? As you think about, how do you capture the essence of someone or something, consider, what do the images below capture? What do they leave out, right? Do they capture everything about Jennifer Lawrence or Bill Gates and his mugshot? Do they capture some things? Yes. Do they leave out some things? Yes. And so what we're thinking about in terms of modern art is, how do we capture the essence of something rather than just the appearance of something, which is a different kind of discussion, a different kind of mindset. So as we take a look at with Van Gogh. Van Gogh's works are legendary in the history of the 19th and 20th century art, and he kind of fulfills this popular view or this stereotype of this misunderstood, tormented artist who only sold one work of art in his life, and so he becomes kind of legendary for that, this misunderstood, underappreciated artist that then becomes, launches himself into kind of this rock star status after his death. A lot of cliches suggest that Van Gogh had this intense genius that he paid for with his sanity, right? So that's kind of this idea, this stereotype then is perpetuated with, that tends to be what a lot of people think artists should be, the tormented, misunderstood, artistic genius who then loses his or her sanity. And he kind of fills that stereotype to a certain extent. But a lot of this misunderstanding of Van Gogh in his life has led to a lot of misunderstanding about Van Gogh after his life, right? So there's a lot of mystique, a lot of mystery about his life, and then people tend to fill in the gaps with whatever kind of artistic imagination that they want. But he did only sell one work of art in his lifetime. He was widely rejected as an artist. People didn't like his works, and then afterwards they just rediscovered his works, and now he's the kind of this legendary status that we see today. And there's even this traveling exhibit of, what's it called, Experiencing Van Gogh, where you can go and experience his works. They put him, some of his works in this visual display of a projector, and it makes it come to life. There was even a movie where they painted the entire movie in the style of Van Gogh. I think it was called Loving Vincent. Interesting movie, mainly focused on the mystery of his death, which there's a lot of ambiguity about whether he shot himself or was accidentally killed. We don't really know how he was shot. We just know that he was shot in the abdomen, and then he died like 2 or 3 days later. But again, he's just this kind of misunderstood artist. What we do know about him is that he was the oldest son of a Protestant minister and studied to become a minister, and so he has this kind of religious faith at the core of what he's doing. In 1880, he turned to art but maintained his spirituality, and so that's going to be a big part of his art. To him, art was a spiritual experience to transcend the physical world and reach for the divine. Very similar to what we see in a lot of ideas in the Baroque era or the Renaissance, but he's going to do this with a modern flair, right? A modern art style. He studied in The Hague, Brussels, and Antwerp. So he comes from that tradition of this Holland area and where Holland and Flanders area where the Baroque becomes extremely popular, and he's going to then continue the legacy, right? So he's going to walk in the footsteps of people like Rembrandt and then do something different. While initially influenced by Impressionism, Van Gogh was largely self-taught, and he pushes the boundaries of boundaries of art to become part of this avant-garde, doing something extremely new, right? He was only active for 10 years. The last 10 years of his life, he was an artist and kind of a self-taught artist to a certain extent, during which time, though, he produced 1,000 watercolors, drawings and sketches, and about 1,250 paintings, ranging from dark to realistic style to intense impressionistic styles. And so there's a wide range of what he does and an impressive body of work that he leaves behind. Part of it is because the looser brushstrokes enable him to be able to produce a lot more. But there's quite a bit of Van Gogh art out there, which is amazing. Gives us insights into his style, his emerging style. His style focuses on emotions over realism. So that's a big part of what he's seeking to do, trying to emotionally connect the artist and the viewer and to divide the barrier that exists between the viewer and the artist, trying to connect them emotionally. And this is a direct contrast to Impressionism. Impressionism wants to not be overly sentimental or overly emotional. It's about just representing what the eye sees, right? He argued that imagination is better than sight. The real world is always changing, but the mind's eye captures reality, right? So that seems to be a direct response to photography, right? Photography is capturing, I mean, it's not a direct commentary on photography, but it seems to be kind of this indirect commentary on photography where photography is capturing this idea of, reality, and then artist is trying to respond to that by capturing the reality of the inner mind, right? Not that photographers don't capture their own imaginative style and whatnot. It's just artists responding. What do they have to add to this? They have these colors, they have these brushstrokes that they can then add, right? So he says the imagination is certainly a faculty which we must develop, one which alone can lead us to the creation of a more exalting and consoling nature than the single brief glance at reality, right? So imagination gives us an ability to do more, to capture the essence of something rather than just the visual representation of something. He continues, he says, which in our sight is ever-changing, passing like flash of lightning can let us perceive. And so reality just passes before us and is constantly changing. So the idea is he's trying to capture the timeless essence of what really makes something, right? And then the idea of his brushstroke. He continues on the idea of Seurat, although Seurat's early works at least, and then Cezanne with his impasto brushstrokes. His brushstrokes are going to be even thicker, and there's going to be almost a three-dimensional quality to his works. So if you stand in front of a Van Gogh, you'll notice that there's this, they're coming off the canvas in such a thick way that they have this own quality, this own sculptural quality to them. I like to start Van Gogh's works with this one because it reminds me of Idaho, the potato eaters. What we see here is Van Gogh invites us into the intimate space of this family. We feel that we are seated at the table with them in this kind of dark, cramped, cozy, some might say, space, this one bedroom or one room home where these farmers work, right? Or I guess that's not where they work, but it's where they live, right? He finds virtue in their poverty, very similar to what we see with realists. Right? He values their determination and struggle, and he wants us to feel what they feel. He wants us to feel their work and smell the home, their surroundings, their environment. The idea is that art should transcend the image and capture the spirit or nature or fundamental qualities of something, right? So this is what he says about this specific work. He says, I tried to emphasize that those people eating their potatoes in the lamplight have dug the earth with those very hands, and they put in their dish. And so it speaks of manual labor and how they honestly earned their food. Again, how do you capture a family? How do you capture the essence of something, right? And that's what he's seeking to do. You can't just capture the essence of something by visually representing, scientifically representing what it is, because there's more emotions, there's more ideas that are involved within that. And so we need to transcend that idea of just being shackled by visual reality and focus more on emotion. So if you take a look at these individuals here, they look more like cartoon characters in a sense than they actually do on visual reality, right? So the idea is just to capture the spirit of what's happening. Notice, though, that this is very similar to the tradition that he's coming from in terms of Northern Baroque, right? We have the single lamplight that then that just kind of descends upon these individuals, providing light for us to see, and then the rest of the room is darkened. And so definitely influenced by Flanders and Holland. This one is perhaps one of the more haunting images that Van Gogh represents. He doesn't simply want to capture the image of a woman, he wants to capture the essence of death. And that's a different focus. He seeks to portray the ghastly feel of the moment of death to capture its very essence. He knows that you cannot capture death by merely copying the way it looks. You need to focus on colors and the artistic techniques to capture its feel. He wants to confront the viewer with death and to feel it, right? Not necessarily in a scary way, although maybe, but in a similar way to what the person that's experiencing it, kind of the loneliness of it, right? The coldness of it. He wants us to feel that, right? So the dark colors provide a bleak, almost suffocating feel that a person prepares to die. The lines are mainly horizontal to give us this ghastly coffin feel. And the shading demonstrates depth with the lines around her chin and cheeks and legs to give us that feel of realism, right? But this one he starts to move towards this thicker brushstroke. And here we see the idea of an old peasant woman with a white cap. And again, how do you capture age? How do you capture experience? We've talked about these ideas with Rembrandt and the head of an old man in a cap, and how Rembrandt was trying to capture the essence, capturing the truth of something rather than just painting what people wanted to project as their truth and their kind of very polished social media post or whatever of their life. He'd say, I don't want to just give you this kind of polished image. I want to represent the truth, right? The truth of the old man as he kind of looks downward. We see the age, the experience of his years, but also how that has given him wisdom and humility, right? And we see that same idea with Van Gogh's The Head of an Old Peasant Woman with a White Cap, right? Capturing her age and wisdom, but also her humility, that the more we, know, the less, or the more we learn, the less we know, right? That kind of old idea. But here we see the expressive brushstrokes, the very broad, right? Very similar to what we see with Rembrandt's older works, right? His later works, I guess, is a better way to put it, where Rembrandt starts to move towards abstraction. We see that kind of mantle being picked up with Van Gogh as he represents this woman here with these thick applications of paint, and then the darkened room around her, right? He uses a very limited hues, just with brown, black, yellow, and white. And notice how he darkens everything else around to focus our attention on her thoughts, her feelings, right? Capturing her essence. He also focuses much like Rembrandt. Not that I want us to necessarily think about Van Gogh and Rembrandt in connection. We don't necessarily have to. It's just it's interesting that he's coming from that area and kind of picking up influenced by his surroundings. He paints himself a lot. And I want us to think about what do you think Van Gogh captures in himself, right? A lot of selfies, but they're all somewhat different. And he's trying to capture the essence of something. And if he's trying to capture the essence of something, what is he trying to capture, right? So as we see here with a gray felt hat, what is he trying to capture within himself, right? With the looser brushstrokes, there's always going to be this kind of vibrating essence, this kind of fuzziness around his works of art, that they have this sense of energy. I think he saw that that life had an energy to it, that light had an energy to it, and he's representing that. But again, very different from Impressionism. As we take a look at this one in connection with Impressionism, the brushstroke has a much more this vibrance element to it. Not necessarily focusing on the light, not necessarily focusing on the hardships of the industrial world, just capturing, right, the idea of the impressions of an individual. This is a self-portrait with a felt hat. Again, what do you think he's trying to represent? A very different representation of himself, but again, trying to capture the mood and emotion of what he's feeling, blending the background and the foreground together with the blue coat that he's wearing with the blue background, and then juxtaposing kind of that against the very vibrant yellow hat to make it pop, and then having that kind of light around his face and his beard, right? This one's a darker image, again, capturing maybe his dark broodiness, right? That kind of inner mind, the inner eyes of an artist and what the artist sees. This one with the bandaged ear, according to legend, Rembrandt cut off his ear and mailed it to his favorite prostitute. Some question the accuracy of that and suggest that his bandaged ear here is due to he had a condition where he heard a constant ringing in his ear, and during one of those bouts of this kind of intensive noise, he scratched his ear pretty badly. During these bouts, he often would harm himself to try to stop the noise. And one of them, he scratched himself, and so this is the bandaged ear to the wounded ear. The mailing the ear, cutting off an ear and mailing it, is definitely more of a romantic kind of extreme story. The bandaged ear is much more kind of plain and mundane. Whichever one you want to ascribe to is up to you, but there's a lot that we don't know about Van Gogh, right? A lot of mystery that people like to fill in with this romantic imagery. But as we take a look at, it's interesting about the collar itself, very dark, almost like a cartoon outline of it, and then the juxtaposing this with the very bright red and yellow background that kind of frames his head. It gives it this sense of energy and vibrance, and the smoke coming out also kind of makes it seem to radiate. Thinking about the Night Cafe, this was another major work that he does, and we see a stark contrast from his previous images of the potato eaters or the dying woman. This one is very bright and vibrant. It's very colorful. He uses the impasto brushstrokes to focus less on three-dimensionality, right? The idea of making it more flatter, like what we see with Cézanne's works. It's more about putting paint on a canvas and putting colors on the canvas to give us an impression of an idea, an emotion. Not an impression of the world around us, as we see with Impressionism, but an impressionism, an idea, or an impression of an emotion, right? So having roots of Impressionism, but then extending beyond its boundaries, right? The lines are much more in line with Japanismo than traditional art. They do push towards a central axis, but it's not as mathematical and scientific as we would see with previous works of art. The forms in the work, the figures that are represented, become more ambiguous. They're mere outlines. They're smaller because it's not about them. It's about the night cafe, capturing the essence of the night cafe, right? Van Gogh still uses some shading around the pool table, right on the floor, but this is only a semblance of reality, right? The real world is not the focus. He's trying to capture the idea of something, right? And this is what he has to say about this particular work in terms of the color scheme. Notice how he's using complementary colors, which is an intense contrast of colors on the opposite side of the color wheel to produce an intense contrast, right? He says, in my picture, The Night Cafe, I tried to express the idea of the cafe as a place where one can ruin oneself. Right? The idea that the modern world, industrialism, is leading to things like alcoholism, prostitution, crime, right? Go mad or commit a crime. So I tried to express, as it were, the powers of darkness in a low public house by soft Louis XV green and malachite contrasting with yellow-green and harsh blue-greens, and all this in the atmosphere of a devil's furnace of pale sulfur. And so the idea of trying to capture the essence of where people will go to destroy themselves, right? The inner kind of bowels of some inner city, some red light district or whatnot, where people are overcome with confusion, doubt, uncertainty, and leads to a lot of problems. But notice how this one, just to kind of briefly here, the brushstrokes and how we see the shadows underneath the brushstrokes because they're so thickly applied, which is key to Rembrandt, different from what we see with Caillebotte, which focuses on very pristine brushstrokes, but a similar kind of idea of capturing the world around them. What we see with Caillebotte, capturing the rising bourgeoisie and the world around them, this idea of superficiality, capturing a different element of the modern world, focusing more on the poor and the darker, seedy parts of urbanization, right? So we see that contrast between the rising wealth and those that are affected by it, right? So they're responding to similar ideas, similar trends, but they're focusing on different elements and they're representing it differently. Different ideas that we see with Montserrat, with Cézanne, right? The colors are much more vibrant, similar type of smaller color palette, but very bright and vibrant, where we have this kind of energy radiating out from the candles above to give this sense of energy of the night. He often said that he saw more colors at night than he does during the day. Now, I'm not an artist, and so that comment baffles me a little bit, but I think that there's something to that. He sees that night has this sense of energy, and this is a time when electricity is being introduced into the modern urban worlds, and so people are able to do more at night. Before electricity, people mainly just went to bed at night, and they couldn't really, there was no working past sunset. There was no really going out and during the evening. There was to some extent, but not as much as when there was electricity, where people can have this whole sense of a nightlife. And so this is the sense of a nightlife. This one is in Montmartre, where he had a studio, which is kind of in the top part of that hill that we talked about at the very beginning, where you just see a cafe terrace at night. So the energy, the vibrance of the night and the urban city capturing that energy. This one is his most famous one, Starry Night. And he says about his brushstroke, "My brushstroke has no system at all. I hit the canvas with irregular touches of the brush, which I leave as they are." Right? So this idea of that brushstrokes are just what they are, and he's just going to leave them as they are. But this is the image of the night. Again, he sees this kind of energy and passion of the night. He focuses on the cypress tree in the foreground, which has this kind of flame, this kind of eternal flame about it, this kind of fire and energy. And then we see that the kind of the order and safety of the city below. But this is a representation of his memories. A lot of people suggest that this is a view from his window in an asylum, and his memories, his recollections of what that view would look like. And so he's just capturing the essence, and he suggests that memory is much more reliable than reality, right? It's not about capturing the outer world. To post-impressionists, is about capturing the inner nature, right? So very kind of different ideas. And here we see the energy of the moon, and then the stars, and then the planet Venus right here, and then kind of this energy of the wind, the natural elements that are constantly in motion. And so seeing this kind of vibrance of nature, this energy, this passion of nature that we see with Cézanne, juxtaposed with this, the light of the city, the energy of this new emerging city that's on the horizon, coming together and providing this interesting interchange, this interesting exchange. Let's take a look at one more. I know I'm a little bit over time for our class, but I want to take a look at one more artist that's part of Post-Impressionism and is part of this movement of primitivism, which is going to be a big part of other art movements of the late 19th and early 20th century. and even beyond, right? Primitivism is a belief that Western culture has become corrupt due to industrialization. Very similar to what we see with Cezanne, right? Trying to escape the modern life to focus on nature, right? Similar to what we see with Cezanne in his night cafe, where we see that the modern urban world is producing a lot of crime and seedy elements. As such, the argument of primitivism, we have lost touch with our primitive roots. It was believed that primitive cultures had a purity that we somehow have lost. It is similar to the idea of the Garden of Eden was the pinnacle of human civilization, and reason, intellect, civilization, etc., have ruined our natural state. So they're trying to find that natural state. And human reason, intellect lead to things like industrialization, pollution, right? The ideas of exploitation of the working class. They've lead to problems. And lead to war, lead to nationalism and things of that nature. And so they've ruined, they pollute the natural state of humanity. So if we want to find our natural element, we need to return to our primitive roots, right? Artists such as Gauguin sees the corruption of the industrial world and seeks to escape from it. Such artists desire to move away from the traditional constraints of the West to discover a simpler and more harmonious way of life, whether that life is in Africa, as we're going to see with Picasso, or that life is in the Pacific, as we're going to see with Gauguin. The idea is to try to escape the corruptions of European life, of industrialism, to find our natural elements, right? Gauguin's father was a writer for a radical journal in Orleans, and his mother was a militant socialist, so they had a lot of politically radical ideas around the dinner table. The family went on a trip to Peru that influenced him throughout his life. Gauguin initially worked as a stockbroker at a bank, but became aware of Impressionism in 1874. After losing his job in 1882 due to an economic depression at the time, Gauguin turned to painting. He was in search for spiritual meaning and this drove his obsession to primitivism. He felt that the future of art was in the tropics and left for Tahiti in 1895. His art from the island became legendary, as people also kind of were part of that idea. Let's just escape the world around us. The self-portrait of the halo helps us to understand some of the ideas of his works. Notice that the brushstroke is not exactly thick or clear. It's kind of somewhere in between. The main element is the expression of colors, with the contrast between the red and the yellow that they battle, similar to what we see in Van Gogh's The Night Cafe. Also notice how the lines are chaotic and go in every direction. Okay, kind of the lines of the vine here kind of go in every direction and kind of don't really direct us towards one central axis of the work, right? Notice how his head is the center of the study. It's our focus. We are invited to feel what the artists feel. However, the head exists without a body, right? There's nothing that really ties this to reality. So this is, again, a response to the real world, suggesting that art needs to remove itself from the real world. We see Gauguin's selfie here with a halo to show his religious feelings and aspirations, but yet the lack of a body suggests that it's disconnected. Perhaps this is a commentary on the mind, or the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Notice the apples, in which is a traditional iconography. The apples in the background traditionally represent the tree of knowledge. These are the temptations that lead to fall. These are representations of reason, intellect, which leads us away from God according to the traditional interpretation. Notice how the plant or the vine looks to be a snake. So there's a sense that Adam and Eve, right, or a portrait, are here kind of in this, that he is kind of this proverbial Adam, right? And then the snake is there to tempt him with the tree of knowledge. And so again, this idea of industrialization, urbanization, modernism is this idea of progress, human progress, that's leading us away from our roots of primitivism or our natural essence within the Garden of Eden. So similar ideas that we've seen before. And again, we've talked about how if you really understand how a particular moment or era or artist understands the fall or understands Adam and Eve, that helps to think about how the broader context of how they understand humanity, right? Notice how this idea is he's kind of conflicted between the idea of he wants to maintain his true elements, but the natural world or this modern world or this changing world around him is continually kind of moving, leading and directing him away, right? So it could be this kind of struggle, this virtuous struggle against progress or against sin, as progress is kind of labeled as sin in a primitivist kind of mindset. So he leaves and goes to Tahiti and mainly paints images like this for most of his life. He becomes quite disenchanted with it a little bit because he goes to Tahiti and he realizes that it's not as primitive as he thought it was. He had this romantic imagination that they were just going to be, I don't know, this primitive culture. But what happened was that they were trading with the West. And so you see a lot of Paris fashions that are on the beach. And so he was like, oh, all right, not quite what I was thinking. But he starts painting these images, these romantic representations. And then they come back to Paris and people start buying them. And so then he kind of gets into this kind of box of painting images of what people expect, the romantic image of what they expect Tahiti to be, even though reality is a little bit different from that. And eventually he says, I want to go back to Paris. And his art dealer says, don't do that. You're going to ruin your image. You have a brand. Don't destroy the brand. If you come back to Paris, people will be like, wait a minute, I thought this guy was this romantic kind of living this primitive lifestyle, this idea of escapism. That's what we're buying when we buy his art. So if he comes back to Paris and starts, hanging out at a Parisian cafe, it's going to destroy that image. And so he stayed in Tahiti. According to legend, he becomes dissatisfied. He gets an STD. Most likely it was syphilis. Suffering from that, and then he takes some rat poison, and it doesn't go well. He vomits it up, and he struggles. He struggled in Tahiti, even though there's this romantic imagination of him living this kind of primitive life. But what we see within this particular work, neither here nor there, what we see within this particular work is how the figures dominate the picture plane, right? They are extremely large in connection to the background, which centers our attention onto them, right? These ones are more clothed than other images, other representations that we see. We can see somewhat of their more traditional kind of style. However, it's in some ways he almost would have to stage this in order to get this, and a lot of his works had to be somewhat staged in order to get the feeling. But you get the sense that there's water, they're on a beach, and this is this idea of a life very different from the hustle and bustle of the urban world in Paris. And this one is kind of this existential question: where we go, where do we come from, where are we going, or where are we? Kind of idea of, this idea of what is human existence really about? What is the identity? What is the purpose, right? Gauguin's interest in exploring these profound questions and sought to address these through his art, right? What we see here is that human life has stages from, birth to old age, and it's demonstrating all of the complexities of human existence. The figures are surrounded by this lush vegetation, suggesting this harmonious relationship between the natural world and this primitive culture, what industrialism has lost touch with, right? So that kind of idea is embedded with this. The inclusion of the animals in the statuette at the kind of left-hand side demonstrates these more spiritual, mystical aspects of human existence. And this idea of paradise versus paradise lost, right? So this idea that there is this paradise out there and that the Europe has lost this. And so the idea of where do we come from, where are we, and where are we going, in a lot of ways is an existential question about the modern world. Where do we come from? Where are our roots? Do we even know what our roots are anymore if we've lost complete touch with them? Where are we currently today? What are we doing today, and how are we interacting with the world around us? And where are we going? What's the direction? Are we headed towards our own annihilation by, polluting the planet or, creating wars and, technology, whatever? The question is, where are we really headed? And do we really want to be headed there, right? Maybe we need to find our roots, I think, is the undercurrent, the argument of much of his art, and particularly that we see here. But this idea of primitivism reminds me of the movie Midnight in Paris. It's a Woody Allen film. If you haven't seen it, it's hilarious. It talks a lot about art and artists of the 1920s, which we haven't quite got to yet. but it's with Owen Wilson in it. I'm a big Owen Wilson fan. I don't know if you are, but it's about him going to Paris as a writer and having this kind of romantic imagination that his life in, I don't know what it was, the 2010s, whenever the film came out, 2008, 2010, 2012, whenever it was, is just completely lost in a drift. We've lost our sense, we've lost our roots, and he wants to go back to this romantic imagination of Paris in the 1920s, right? And then one person says this idea of primitivism, as we're going to kind of frame it, he calls it nostalgia within the film, is denial. Denial is the painful present. The name for this denial is golden age thinking, which maybe to some extent Cezanne had, to some extent Gauguin may have had. The erroneous notion that a different time period is better than the one one's living in. It's a flaw in the romantic imagination of those people who find it difficult to cope with the present. And I think that there's something to that. I think Cezanne had a difficulty coping with the present. I think, Van Gogh may have had some difficulty coping with the present. Gauguin had some difficulty coping with the present. And it's not just them. I think a lot of other artists of Impressionism and even Realism had similar kind of, frustrations. And I think even today, we have this similar kind of idea. I've noticed a lot of people kind of take a look at the world around us and they say, oh, humanity has never been this bad. Right? And that's kind of the argument that Gauguin was making. Humanity has never been this bad, and it's only going to get worse from here. We see that argument all the time, that humanity has never been this bad, and we're heading in the wrong direction. But maybe if we can somehow get back to whatever era it was, 1920s in Owen Wilson's case in the film, 1950s as it is in some people's case, 1990s, whatever it is, there was a time when humanity was pure. And we've lost that purity, right? This paradise that is lost. And I, in some ways, maybe. In other ways, I think that we have a lot of advancements. I think we have a lot of things that to offer today in terms of science, in terms of medicine, in terms of technology, in terms of social movements. I think a lot of minorities and women and whatnot have a lot more freedoms today than historically. So there has been progress, and if we only look at the negative, then that's all we'll see. And it's not to suggest that women today have, they're at the pinnacle of equality and whatnot, or minorities are at the pinnacle of equality or not. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just suggesting that we're definitely there's a lot of things that we're better off today, and we can fall into this trap of this denial of looking back to some earlier age and thinking that something is better, and that today is the worst that humanity has ever been. Yeah, there's some problems that we have today, but there's some problems that every era would have. And so, I don't know, just to gently push against those ideas. But this is the idea of primitivism. We'll see this again when we take a look at somewhat of Art Nouveau. We'll take a look at this when we take a look at the pre-Raphaelites. To some extent, we'll see this with Picasso and Cubism. So this is going to be a continual theme within art that I wanted to introduce, that artists, as they're responding to the modern world, there's severe anxieties, hesitations about the changing world around them and the current state, which there's a lot of negativity, certainly. And so they're going to be responding to that. So it's just one response among many responses to the changing world around them.